how are you today? I'm doing well. Today I am here to talk to you about the overview of British literature, and I am going to go over with you today the literature, authors, and major literary movements that we will be learning this year. So it's going to be good. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. So the lesson objectives for today are to understand the importance of studying literature and the influence of historical events, and to understand the importance of historical events when classifying literary periods. And one of the objectives is also to identify and describe the literary movements from medieval to postmodernism, and be able to identify their specific characteristics. Along with this, you will be able to, by the end of this lesson, to identify the important works of literature and the major authors who wrote them for each of these significant literary periods. The medieval period is from 600 to 1500. It's a rough estimate, give or take. It is a very long literary movement. We will study a work of literature that is an epic poem called Beowulf, and it is considered to be the first major work of literature that is thought to exist. But Gilgamesh is also one that was thought to exist way before as well, so there's a little bit of conflicting scholarly opinions on this. No one really knows though, because the reason they don't really know is because it was passed down by oral tradition, which means word, spoken word. And this work of literature is written in what is called Old English. It sounds very gibberish sounding, and it's very hard to understand. We may take a look at what that actually does sound like, because Old English is the predecessor to our current language, so it is worth hearing what we used to sound like way back when, so it's kind of cool. Many experts think that Beowulf was written in the 8th century. Again, it was so long ago that no one really knows because it was passed on through oral tradition. So it's kind of just, hearsay or hypothetical time period. The story features Beowulf, who confronts this monster named Grendel, and then he fights Grendel's mother. Anyway, and then he fights a dragon. It's kind of cool. It's an interesting story, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. And then we are also going to learn about a guy named Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales. And he is a very interesting individual in that this compilation of tales is sort of a collection of these really scandalous, raunchy, filthy tales about, pilgrims. They were trying to have like a storytelling contest while they were on their way to this famous shrine. Anyway, it's a favorite of people who study literature, and they love this stuff because it's like totally full of these rich, fun things and playing with different styles and forms. It's just really cool. And it's full of all kinds of layers and allegory and symbol and anyway, it's a lot of fun to study. Chaucer was really ahead of his time. You could say he was a pioneer of his time because, he invented a form or a different style, which is to have a complete work that's, several different stories put into one, essentially book, if you will, the tales. Okay. So the content and purpose of medieval literature, well, it's just sort of all over the place. There are a few things that you need to keep in mind when studying the medieval period. First, these are very heavy in religious context. People during this time were very driven by religious motivation, and the Canterbury Tales is one really good example of this. The second is anonymity. We don't really know who wrote Beowulf. It's sort of anonymous, anonymity, anonymous. Writers didn't really credit themselves. They considered themselves retellers of a story if something was passed on through oral tradition, for example. The third thing, in Old English, works during this time period were written in Old English, so it's incomprehensible. You have to basically study Old English, and it's like learning another language. You can definitely read it, and we're going to practice reading a very small bit of it. Your literature textbook does a very good job of giving you the already translated version that's not in Old English, so you're lucky. So after we move out of the medieval period, we will move into the Renaissance. The Renaissance was the 14th through the 17th centuries. It means rebirth. Renaissance, rebirth. And this basically is what the Renaissance was all about. If you really think about what's involved with rebirth, of flourishing, of culture, of art, of literature. So rebirth of all of those things. The reason why England flourished a little bit later, more so toward the 16th century, I would say. Prominent writers like William Shakespeare, for example, are one of the reasons why there was a flourishing of the arts. There were several artists as well during this time period who really made an appearance. We're going to focus on the literature though, but if you're interested in studying Renaissance art, it's always a fun subject to tackle. Anyway, prominent writers like Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, and Shakespeare. Obviously, Shakespeare is one of the reasons, well, he is the father, I think, of, literature today. A lot of our sayings come from Shakespeare, so it's kind of fun to study this period. I think we're going to take a look at Macbeth. Don't hold me to that because there's so many great Shakespeare plays. I haven't decided. So during this time period, writers think about their position in the world and, trying to be independent of religious motivations. Not completely removed from it, obviously. They value the dignity of man and the joys of society much more than their predecessors in the medieval period. This is known as humanism, and this is like a really big influence during the Renaissance. Not just in literature, okay? But it was just everywhere. They started to embrace literature as an art form, which is not something that the medieval period did at all. They began to embrace it in such a way as to appreciate it as more than just a story, but to appreciate it also as art. And the first major work of criticism during this time period, because this is when literary criticism became a thing, was Philip Sidney's The Defense of Poesy or Poetry. And basically that was just a fancy word for poetry, posy, or yeah, it's weird. But it was the first work of literary criticism, so, just so you know, that's where literary criticism came from during the Renaissance. Writers became more conscious, art as art, and began criticizing forms of literature, art, etc. They were conscious of the fact that it was art. So therefore they had a thing or two to say about it, which is, every good critic does, right? So during this time period, this was the birth of the Protestant Reformation, and religious people began to question objectionable doctrines from the church, the Roman Catholic Church. And because they started to question these doctrines, a new criticism and a new way of thinking came about. And this is a crucial mark for this time period because it was not only both in religion, but it was with the Reformation and works of art as well. One invention was the printing press. And because of the printing press, you could put literature in people's hands, which was a really important thing to do to disseminate information. So once they were able to transmit these works of literature, it made it a lot easier to transmit ideas and so forth to other people. Remember, back then they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have social media. All they had was the written word, and that is how they got information passed around. That and carrier pigeons probably, right? So after the Renaissance, we move straight into the Enlightenment, or the 18th century. And during the 18th century, science, logic, and intellectual discourse were the underpinnings of this literary movement. So they really started to question, hey man, does any of this stuff really make sense that we're practicing and believing and living our day-to-day lives? They questioned things, which was very, very new for this particular time period. People began pulling away from just blindly following their faith and believing what we call blind faith, and they became more real and scientific people. So they weren't just, as gullible, I guess you could say. In other words, writers began to challenge and question what was previously a given, okay? And they would challenge it, question it. Writers, I think also and artists alike, began to question, government and society and why there was this systematic approach that there was in place, and if it was effective or not, and what needed to change about it. So, they usually did this in the form of fiction to protect themselves because you could be hanged for airing your opinions. But they also did this in the form of essays. During the Enlightenment or the 18th century, we can give a little shout out to American writers during this time period. You might remember last year during English 11, learning about Benjamin Franklin and, American colonist rebellion against Britain, and, sort of like playing out those ideals of the Enlightenment over in America. So there, the idea of, what's fair government, what's governance of being fair, what's something rational, something real, something logical, this idea of independence. Okay. So shout out to American literary people, but we're British lit, so we're gonna keep trucking forward. Okay. So moving on into the literary movement that we know as Romanticism. You might remember this from your American literature studies as well. The same thing, early 19th century Romanticism in British literature. Writers move away from scientific reasoning and they move more toward emotional thinking, and they move toward feeling, nature, emotion, the positive and the negative. And they do this, meaning the key figures during this time period, who are William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Blake, Mary Shelley, John Keats. Okay, so all these people, they write these ballads, they write these odes, they're full of nature, they're full of description and like mood, and in Mary Shelley's case, full of Gothic ideas and science and the invention of the creature, and it's so fun. Anyway, we also have novelists like Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters, who I'm sure you've heard of. There's been a couple blockbuster movies after a couple of the famous novels that they've written. And then we clear all the way to the Victorian literary movement, or Victorianism, in 19th century, late 19th century. And this is the height of literature in England. It is the height. And the novel is a new form, and it becomes front and center It's new, it's interesting. Writers like Charles Dickens and George Eliot take front and center stage, and they perfect the novel as a form. Previously, poetry was the height of the literary form, but now the novel is sort of stealing that spotlight. You have that. And when you have that, it's all good. During Victorianism, late 19th century, romance in the sense of love, yes, love, not in the sense of romantic literature, was the key trope of Victorian literature. Now, we have the value of hard work. It's very virtuous, the hard work, okay? And the idea that bad people are punished and good people are rewarded. So that is one of the themes as well. And we also have the structure of the novel taking shape. The idea that a longer story has a beginning, a middle, and an ending. So that was something that came to fruition during the Victorian era. Not only was this like part of the novel form, but it was also part of other literary forms as well. The idea that a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That might seem like commonplace knowledge, but it really wasn't a perfected form, and it was just starting to happen during this time period. And then we move to the literary movement of modernism. Modernism is like early 20th century, and writers became a little bit more cognizant or aware of their form, structure, style, and language. So they design literature as an art form, and they design art and create art for art's sake, meaning they do it just because it's art, which is beautiful in its own right. And it's the idea of aestheticism, or what is aesthetically pleasing, like art forms to see or art forms to read. The question is, what does it mean? What does this mean? It makes sense that they would question that because of what they just came out of. They came out of World War I, and it was a hugely traumatic environment in Europe. And one would question, the world around them if they had just come out of a serious traumatic event. So it does make sense that they would question basically everything in the world. So, literature expressed, or authors expressed, that you could see what's wrong with the world. You could see it, but you might not ever be able to fix it. They were very cynical, heavy with the use of irony, and they pointed out problems. Yeah, a lot of literature in the modern period points out the kind of problems that existed during that time period. They don't really offer solutions, but they just point out the problems. That's to say that, authors like T.S. Eliot and his poem The Wasteland, I feel like that might be an explanation of what this literary movement is all about. So definitely taking a look at The Wasteland. James Joyce's really crazy Ulysses, where, yeah, you'll see it. You'll know it when you see it. It's very all over the place. Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man, and Virginia Woolf's Miss Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, and Yeats's, W.B. Yeats's, The Second Coming. That's modern, early 20th century British literature, and yeah, good stuff, really good stuff. And then we are rolling straight into postmodernism. That's right, postmodernism. Late 20th century and beyond. So like this is where the buck stops, you know? So where are we right now? Postmodernism? Well, there are subsections within this literary movement, just like every other. But postmodernism is an amplification, honing in on modernist thought and really examining it. You know, writers during this time period really focused on the concept of deconstruction. Deconstruction, what does that mean? Well, it sounds just like the word. You can take it apart. It's the idea that you can look at a work and see all of the inherent contradictions, and within all of those structures within a work, you can take those apart too. And, you know, then we take for granted, obviously, repeating and the repeating and the reappearing parts, you know, in a work. But they look at those things and see what the purpose is that they are there. They take them apart and they say, this is here for a reason. Why is that reason? They question it, that sort of thing. In postmodernists, it's a tongue twister and mouthful. In postmodernist writing, the writers focus on, you know, being subjective. Subjectivity allows us to deconstruct things and look at things at the structural level, sentence by sentence, word by word sometimes, theme by theme, situation by situation. And it really allows us to look at the perspective that the writer is coming from and consider all the variables, okay? So it's the idea that nothing is certain at all, nothing is certain, and everything is subjective. Subjective to X, Y, Z, and beyond. So that's deconstruction. And that is the premise of postmodernism. And it focuses on the idea that there is no unified truth at all, and that, you know, writing can mean anything. It has multiple meanings. So postmodernism is user-friendly, I guess you could say. So you might be asking yourself, well, what's the difference between modernism and postmodernism then? Because it sounds like there's a lot of similarities. Well, modernists saw that the world was broken. They saw that things didn't make sense anymore. They questioned it. They really tried to process and figure it out. They tried to show that things didn't make sense. Postmodernists, they think that there's no world to break. It's very esoteric, if you will. Modernists think that the world has lost meaning, okay? And postmodernists feel there's no loss, essentially, because there was no world to begin with. So, again, very esoteric. And the point, I guess, is that things are subjective. Subjective. There is no central truth. So, there it is. Prominent writers during postmodernism are writers like Kurt Vonnegut. You may have heard of him. He wrote Harrison Bergeron, which was an interesting piece of literature that highlighted a lot of the postmodernist, tenets and tropes. Writers like Thomas Pynchon and Philip Dick, David Foster Wallace. Basically any work of literature that was released post half century it probably has some kind of post element in it. Think about Harry Potter, for example. Like, I'm sure you could find something postmodern in there. There are lots of works of literature that resemble postmodernist thought and ideas and questions and themes. So that might be something to think about when you're reading your next novel. It might seem like a literary movement that can like last forever, because I guess it can, because, you know, where are we right now? Like I said earlier, I guess we're in postmodernism or somewhere in there. But yeah, so critics definitely talk about this and argue about this, and yeah, so here we are, we're in the postmodernism times 20. So anyway, that's all I've got. And that is the overview of British literary movements for British literature. And yeah, and I appreciate you joining me today. So thanks for joining me. And thank you for watching. And I will see you in my next one. Bye.